The Smeltings uniform was, in Dudley Dursley's considered opinion, the finest thing he had ever worn. He had stood before the mirror in the back bedroom that morning for quite a long time, longer than his mother usually permitted, which was saying something. And he had decided that the maroon tailcoat was distinguished, the orange knickerbockers were jaunty, gave him the air of someone important. The knobbly stick was the cherry on top. He had given it a few experimental swings while his mother was still downstairs, and the weight of it sat in his hand in a way that felt authoritative. He was not entirely sure what authoritative felt like, but he was fairly sure this was it. Magnificent, his mother had said twice when he came downstairs. His father had clapped him on the shoulder and said that Smeltings was the making of a man, as it had been the making of Vernon Dursley himself, and Dudley had eaten an extremely large breakfast and loaded his trunk into the car with the satisfaction of someone who was exactly where they were supposed to be in life. His cousin, he had been dimly aware, was also departing for some boarding school today, some school nobody in the family had ever properly named when Dudley was in earshot. But this was Smeltings. And Dudley Dursley had not given the matter a second thought. One thought was usually more than sufficient. Smeltings Academy smelled of old stone and floor wax and, inexplicably, the distant memory of boiled cabbage. None of this bothered Dudley in the slightest. He carried his stick through the front entrance with a proprietary air, noting with approval the other boys in their maroon tailcoats, all of them similarly equipped, all of them identically hatted. He was among his own kind. He approved of the culture immediately, and he particularly approved of the part of the orientation that explained the stick as an implement for the development of character and good training for later life. One of the older boys had demonstrated this within the first 5 minutes of term by giving a first year a cheerful knock across the shins, and everyone had treated this as perfectly normal, which Dudley also approved of. He had known Smeltings would suit him. He was built for Smeltings. He had the constitution for a proper education. The form teacher was a man named Mr. Bradley, who had ginger eyebrows and an air of patient resignation that Dudley associated with people who dealt with children professionally. He arranged the class in a large circle, 20 boys in identical tailcoats, and explained that they would go around the group and share one interesting thing about their home lives. This was a familiar sort of exercise. Dudley had done something similar at primary school, and had won convincingly every year, by describing the television in his bedroom, which was a Sony with a remote control, and the look on the other children's faces had been extremely satisfying. He settled back in his chair and waited for his turn. Most of the other boys said fairly ordinary things. One had a dog, one had been to France twice, one had a grandfather who was a dentist. Dudley paid very little attention. He was composing his own contribution, which he had decided would mention both the television and the fact that his bedroom was now, by some considerable margin, the largest in the house, given that his cousin had recently been moved into the second bedroom, which was much smaller. He had not been moved. He was Dudley Dursley, and he did not get moved. When it was his turn, he said, "My name's Dudley Dursley, and we've got a cousin who used to live in our house." He paused. He hadn't entirely planned what came next, but the exercise was about interesting things, and this was interesting. He could feel it being interesting. He pushed on. He used to sleep in the cupboard, under the stairs. Proper cupboard had a bed in it and everything. He did all the cooking and the washing up as well. He grinned at the boy across from him. Like a servant, basically. He had expected laughter. He had expected the kind of impressed, slightly appalled response he usually got when he told people about Harry, which was rarely but which always landed. He'd imagined the words servant and cupboard doing considerable work. He'd imagined the boy across from him, elbowing the one beside him. Mr. Bradley did not laugh. His ginger eyebrows went very still. His expression did something that Dudley could not quite catalogue. It was not disapproval exactly, and it was not surprise exactly, and it was not the pleasant, slightly glazed attentiveness with which he had listened to the dentist's grandson. It was a different expression altogether. Dudley became aware of it approximately 1 second too late, which was not enough time to be useful. "That's very interesting," Mr. Bradley said, in a voice that was quite flat. "Your cousin. How long did he sleep in the cupboard?" Dudley had the sensation of being part way across a corridor and realizing, mid-step, that the floor ahead was not there. He could not have explained why. The question was simple. "Since he was a baby," he said, "he was in there about 10 years. The moment the number left his mouth, he knew, in a confused and stomach-dropping way, that it had been the wrong number to say. Not that there was a right number. He couldn't have said what a right number would have been. But Mr. Bradley's face had just changed in a way that felt, with the certainty of instinct rather than thought, like a problem. "Thank you, Dudley," Mr. Bradley said, and moved on to the boy beside him. After class, in the corridor, Dudley held his smelting stick and tried to locate the exact moment things had gone wrong. He replayed the exercise twice. He could not find it. He hadn't said anything that wasn't true. The cousin had been in the cupboard. The cousin had done the washing up. These were facts. He had stated facts. That was what you did in sharing exercises. He had done the exercise correctly. The feeling in his stomach was one he did not have much experience with and did not enjoy. It was the feeling of having said something you couldn't unsay, though he couldn't have explained why this particular thing should need unsaying. He hadn't been unkind. He hadn't even been specific. He'd just said what was what. He spotted a smaller first year moving too slowly in the corridor ahead, and gave him a companionable knock on the ankle with the stick, which he then felt considerably better about. This was good training for later life. This was the whole point of Smeltings. He squared his shoulders, went to the next class, and by lunchtime the feeling in his stomach had reduced to a small, persistent twist that he ate a very large meal, directly on top of which. He did not think about his cousin. Harry was at some school. Harry was someone else's problem now, which had always struck Dudley as the most efficient possible arrangement. Dudley Dursley was at Smeltings where he belonged, and he was a Smeltings man now, same as his father before him, and all of it, the uniform, the stick, the stone corridors, the floor wax smell, the shepherd's pie that was almost but not quite as good as his mother's, all of it was exactly what he had been owed. That evening, in his dormitory, Dudley wrote a letter to his mother on the writing paper she had packed him. He described the uniform in considerable detail. He described the stick. He described the dining hall, which was large and had high ceilings and served a shepherd's pie of genuine quality. He described his dormitory, which had 4 beds and was perfectly adequate, though he had already identified the one with the best access to the window and claimed it. He did not describe the exercise. He was not sure why he didn't. He simply didn't. He signed the letter Love. Dudley sealed it in the envelope she had also packed for him and set it on his bedside table to post in the morning. Down the corridor, in the small office attached to the form room, Bradley sat at his desk. He had been sitting there for some time with a pad of paper before him and a pen in his hand, the standard safeguarding referral form that Smeltings maintained, as required, in compliance with the county council's policies. He had filled in many of these forms over the years. He had never filled in one quite like this. He read back what he had written. He read it back a second time. Then he addressed an envelope to the Smeltings safeguarding lead, sealed the referral inside, and placed it in his out tray. It sat there in the quiet of the empty office, waiting to be read. In the dormitory, Dudley Dursley pulled the blankets up and thought about the shepherd's pie and about whether the common room television had a remote, and about the fact that he had hit that first year in the corridor quite squarely on the ankle, which had been a genuinely good hit, well aimed. And he was reasonably sure that this was exactly the kind of thing Smeltings had been built to teach him. He did not think about the cupboard. He did not think about his cousin. He went to sleep, and the note sat in the out tray, and something had begun. The referral arrived on a Tuesday, forwarded from the Smeltings safeguarding led to the Surrey County Council duty desk by internal post. It was not a long document. The language was standard, the form was familiar, and the worker who picked it up from the stack had processed enough of them to read between the lines before she reached the second paragraph. She read it through once. Then she read the key sentence again. A child had slept in a cupboard under the stairs of the family home for approximately 10 years, from infancy. The child's name was Harry Potter. His current address of residence was recorded as a boarding school, name and location not specified beyond the word Scotland. She set the form down, picked up her pen and made a note in the margin, unannounced welfare visit. 4. Privet Drive. I've Little Winging. The street was everything the referral had not prepared her for, immaculate, quiet, and so determinedly ordinary that it felt almost aggressive about it. Every car in every driveway was recently washed. Number 4 sat in the middle of a terrace of identical houses and looked from the outside like a place where nothing irregular had ever occurred. This, in the experience of the 2 workers who knocked on the door that Wednesday morning, meant very little. The man who answered was large and broad-shouldered, with a thick moustache and almost no visible neck, and his face went through several colors in rapid succession before settling on a shade of puce that the workers recognized as the opening stage of bluster. He was wearing a tie. He was clearly the kind of man who wore a tie in his own home on a Wednesday morning and who expected this to communicate something. "Yes," he said, and the word had the shape of a warning in it. They identified themselves. They explained the nature of the visit. They had received a safeguarding referral concerning a child resident at this address, and they would like to speak with someone about it, and if the family didn't mind, they would like to take a brief look at the property. Standard procedure. Nothing to be alarmed about. The man, Vernon Dursley, as he eventually introduced himself, the emphasis suggesting that the name ought to have meant something, went through the colors again. He explained at some volume that there had clearly been a misunderstanding. He explained that his family was perfectly respectable. He explained that 4 Privet Drive was not the sort of address that received this sort of call. He used the phrase perfectly normal family 3 times, which the workers also recognized and also noted. They asked politely to see the cupboard under the stairs. The cupboard was beneath the main staircase, set into the wall of the front hallway, accessed by a door that had 2 locks on it, one at the standard height, one lower, positioned in a way that made sense only if the person being secured on one side of the door was considerably shorter than the person securing it from the other. The workers examined this detail without commenting on it. They opened the door. The space inside was small. It was darker than it should have been, given the hour and the pale September morning beyond the front door, and it smelled of must and old wood and something underneath those things that was harder to name, but not hard to identify. There was a bed in it, a child's bed, low and narrow, fitted so precisely into the space that it must have been installed deliberately or acquired specifically because it was the right size to disappear into this particular cupboard. Spiderwebs gathered in the angles of the ceiling, and where the wall met the low, sloping underside of the stair, the plaster had a greyish quality that spoke of years without light. On the inner face of the door, At a height consistent with small hands, the wood bore a faint series of marks, the kind made by fingers trying the latch from the inside, the kind that did not appear on doors that children could freely open. One of the workers wrote in her notebook, the other held the door open and said nothing. It was at this point that Petunia Dursley appeared from the direction of the kitchen, and the atmosphere of the hallway changed completely. She was thin and fair-haired, with a long neck that she held very precisely, and her voice when she spoke was pleasant in the careful way of someone who had practiced it for an occasion they had long anticipated. She suggested the workers might like a cup of tea. She explained that the boy, she called him the boy, not by name, had been moved to his proper bedroom upstairs some weeks ago before the start of term. She gestured gracefully toward the staircase. She mentioned boarding school. Scotland, she said without elaborating. Very good school. Harry was perfectly settled. The workers thanked her for the tea. They asked about the bed in the cupboard. Petunia said it had simply not been removed yet. She would see to it. There had been rather a lot to organize this summer, as anyone with a child starting secondary school would understand. They wrote that down too. The cupboard had no books in it and no toys, and nothing that belonged to a child beyond the bed itself. No drawings tacked to the wood, no football stickers, no evidence that the person who had slept there had had any other life than sleeping there. A storage space might have held boxes, tools, the accumulated domestic clutter of a decade. This held only the bed. The workers noted this. They noted the locks. They noted the marks on the door. They noted Petunia's voice and what it chose to say, and the equal weight of what it chose not to. They scheduled a follow-up visit, thanked the Dursleys for their time, and left. The door had barely closed behind them before Vernon Dursley spoke. He was going to ring the school. He was going to ring Dudley's housemaster. He was going to ring the council directly and complain about harassment of law-abiding residents. And he would like to see them justify sending 2 people to his door on the strength of some bureaucratic nonsense from some nobody at some school who had clearly gotten hold of a story and twisted it entirely out of proportion. "Don't," Petunia said. He kept going. She waited. When he ran out of volume, she said very quietly, they did not want to ring anyone. They did not want to draw further attention to this household. They needed a solicitor quietly, through the right channels, and they needed to behave in a way that looked like a family with nothing to hide, because the alternative was a family that rang up schools and councils and made a great deal of noise and invited people to look at them more closely. He did not want that. He hissed something about the boy and the cupboard in the same breath, as though the 2 things were inseparable, as though they always had been. Then he went into the sitting room and closed the door. Petunia stood in the hallway for a moment, very still. Through the narrow gap in the front curtains, she could see the workers' car moving slowly down Privet Drive and turning at the end of the street. She watched it go. Then she turned and looked at the cupboard door, which was still slightly ajar, the way it had been left when the workers came out. She did not close it. She went back to the kitchen, and the cupboard door stayed as it was, open just enough to show the dark inside and the narrow bed and the spider webs holding their shape in the corners, patient as anything, undisturbed. The ceiling of the great hall was doing something extraordinary. Harry had been at Hogwarts for 11 days, and he had looked at the ceiling at every meal, trying to understand why it was so difficult to look away. It was enchanted, charmed to reflect the sky outside, and tonight it was a deep, particular blue, the blue that only happened after the sun went down, but before it was properly dark, with one early star in the upper left corner. He ate his shepherd's pie. The food at Hogwarts was he had discovered entirely serious about being food. It arrived in quantity, it was hot in the way that meant it had just been made, and on the first night of the feast he had eaten until something inside him registered that there was enough, that he could stop, and he had sat very still for a moment trying to name the sensation. He had not been able to. He hadn't had enough practice with it. Ron Weasley, sitting beside him with a generous mound of roast potato, said, "Are you all right?" "Yes," Harry said. "I'm fine." He was, in ways he could not have articulated and would not have thought to, extremely fine. He had a bed upstairs with curtains around it. He had a trunk that held things that were his. He was learning the castle the way you learned any place you intended to stay, the creak of the third stair on the left, the draught that moved through the first-floor corridor in the evenings, the particular ghost near the bathroom who said good evening to everyone and genuinely meant it. He was learning to expect welcome without waiting to find out if it would be revoked. "Transfiguration tomorrow," Ron said, with the air of someone assessing a situation that could go either way. "Is it good?" "McGonagall's brilliant," Ron said, in the considered tone of a person who had made this assessment carefully and stood behind it. But very strict, Harry had already noticed both of these things. Minerva McGonagall taught Transfiguration because she had been teaching it for 35 years, and because there was no better subject in the curriculum for finding out what a child was before they knew you were looking. Theory showed you what they had been told. Practice showed you everything else. She found out the usual things in the first 3 lessons: who was disciplined, who was anxious, who was performing curiosity for someone else's benefit, who had been carefully prepared and who had been left to manage on their own. She found out whose effort was genuine and whose was ornamental. She found out, somewhere in the 3rd lesson, that Harry Potter's effort was neither of these things. It was something she recognized from a longer time ago than she generally permitted herself to think about. He was not performing. He was not showing off. And he was not performing modesty. He was working quietly, without drawing attention to himself, the way a person worked when they had learned that drawing attention produced unpredictable results. His wand technique was imprecise, and he had to correct it twice. His eventual partial transformation of the match was unimpressive but methodical. What she noticed was the carefulness. The carefulness of someone who had learned that getting things wrong had consequences they would rather avoid. She said his name twice during the lesson. Once to correct his wand angle, once to acknowledge that his second attempt showed marked improvement. He looked up both times with a surprise that was one beat too long to be simple modesty. He had not expected to be addressed directly and positively in the same sentence. She catalogued this alongside the 2 large clothes he'd arrived in: shirts that drowned his narrow shoulders, trousers held up by a belt cinched to a worn hole, and alongside the faint hesitation in his posture when someone reached across him, which he had smoothed to near invisibility. She had been noticing things like this since she was a tabby cat on a garden wall in Surrey, and she had done nothing with the noticing for 10 years, which was not a comfortable thing to sit with. After the lesson, she watched the first years file out, Harry's untidy black head disappearing around the door beside the tallest of the Weasley boys, and she permitted herself the thought she had spent a decade not permitting herself. She had told Dumbledore those people were the wrong sort. She had said it. He had told her that what must be, and she had bitten back her disagreement, and it had not mattered. And then 10 years had passed, and the disagreement was still where she had put it. She gathered the lesson materials. She did not permit the thought a second time. That evening, she worked through the first-year intake parchments in her office. Guardian names, home addresses, medical notes, any circumstances that might affect a student's progress. She did this every September. It was administrative and unremarkable, usually. She came to Harry Potter's form. She read the address, 4 Privet Drive, Ive, Little Whinging, Surrey. She read the guardian's name, Petunia Dursley. She sat with the name for longer than she had intended. Petunia Dursley, née Evan, the sister who had taken the boy in. Grudgingly, she was sure, having met Petunia Evans exactly once in the context of a different lifetime, and whose house the boy had now left to come here. She did not know anything beyond this. She had not allowed herself to know more, because knowing more would have required her to do something about what she knew, and what she was allowed to do about it was nothing. And she had understood this, and had spent 10 years understanding it. She capped her pen. She put the intake forms in their folder. She sat in the quiet of her office for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, then went to bed. In the Gryffindor common room, Harry sat at a table near the window with a piece of parchment and a quill. The fire was going. Ron had fallen asleep in the armchair by the hearth with a charms textbook open on his chest. Harry had been sitting with the parchment for some time. He ought to write to the Dursleys. He knew he ought to. He held the quill over the blank page and tried to find the beginning of a sentence, and couldn't. It was not anger. It was not reluctance. It was more like looking through a window at a view he had expected to feel something about, and finding only the glass. He folded the parchment without writing on it, and put it in his pocket, in case something came to him later. Then he went upstairs and got into bed and pulled the red curtains around himself and thought, not about the Dursleys, but about the ceiling and the shepherd's pie and the first early star, and the fact that he had a bed with 2 thick blankets and that both of them were always sufficient, and that this was, for now, the whole of what he needed to know. The letter stayed unwritten. 200 miles south, the matter was being handled by people he had never met and would not think to imagine. Arabella Figg had spent 10 years learning to watch 4 Privet Drive without appearing to watch it, which was not as difficult as it sounded. The trick, she had found, was the cats. A woman standing at a window with a cat on the sill looked like a woman standing at a window with a cat on the sill, which was unremarkable and aroused no neighborly curiosity. In this way she had observed the comings and goings of the Dursley household through 4 prime ministers and a great many of Petunia's curtain replacements, and had reported what mattered to the address she had been given for exactly this purpose, and had received no reply of any kind which she understood to be confirmation. She saw the car on a Wednesday in September, not a Dursley car and not a neighbor's car, the right sort of plane it was, the kind of anonymous vehicle that belonged to a council office or a health trust. 2 people got out with lanyards. They went to the front door of number 4, and Vernon Dursley answered it, and after a minute or 2 of what Arabella could read from her window, as the kind of conversation Vernon Dursley had with people who did not respond to his opening bluster, they went inside. They were in there for the better part of an hour. Duchess, the most attentive of her cats, sat beside her the whole time, with her pumpkin-colored eyes fixed on the house with the focused intelligence that Arabella had always found slightly uncanny and rather comforting. When the workers came back out and drove away, Duchess watched the car to the end of the street before looking up at Arabella, who reached down and scratched her behind the ears. "I know," Arabella said. "I'll write to him." She did not write often. She had written twice in 10 years, once when the boy had been taken to hospital for stitches, which had turned out to be nothing, and once when she herself had broken her leg and needed to explain why she could not take the boy on Dudley's birthday. This would be the 3rd letter. She was fairly sure it was the most important of the 3. She kept it short. She described what she had seen, the car, the lanyards, the hour inside. She wrote that they had examined the cupboard under the stairs because the curtains had been open just enough and she had known the layout of that house for a decade. She wrote that the workers were coming back. She sealed the envelope and addressed it to the forwarding address, a solicitor's office in London that had been relaying correspondence to Hogwarts for longer than Arabella knew, and posted it the next morning. A week later, the letter arrived on the desk of Albus Dumbledore. His office in the late afternoon had the quality of a room that had seen more than one century and was comfortable with this. The portraits of former headmasters dozed in their frames. A spindly silver instrument on the desk turned slowly on its axis, measuring something Dumbledore no longer needed to check. He read Arabella's letter standing, which he almost never did, and set it down on the desk and stood with his hands clasped behind his back and looked out the high window at the grounds, where the last of the September light was lying golden across the grass. He was not surprised. That was the first thing and the most damning. He was not surprised in any way at all, which was because he had known. Since the morning of the 24th of July 1991, exactly where Harry Potter had been sleeping. The Hogwarts enchantments had told him. The address on the acceptance letter had told him, written out in precise moving script, Mr. H. Potter. The cupboard under the stairs, 4 Privet Drive Ive, Little Winging, Surrey. He had read it. He had registered what a cupboard under the stairs necessarily implied. He had moved on to the next letter in his correspondence. He stood at the window for a long time. That evening, he sent a note to Severus Snape. Snape arrived at the office precisely on time, as he always did, and sat in the chair across from Dumbledore's desk with his hands folded in his lap and his expression arranged in the careful blankness he used for conversations he anticipated would require it. He was 31 years old and looked, as he often did, as though he had arrived from a direction the world had not been expecting. Dumbledore told him what had happened in a small number of sentences: a Muggle school, a disclosure, social services, a welfare visit to the Dursley house the cupboard examined, a follow-up visit scheduled. He paused. "The boy has been moved to a proper bedroom now," Dumbledore said. "He was at Privet Drive until he came to us. But before that, for approximately the 10 years preceding September, he slept in the cupboard under the stairs." Snape said nothing for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was level in the way of something held very carefully level. "You knew," he said. "It was not a question. The Hogwarts letters address themselves automatically. The enchantments write where the student is living." The first letter to Harry Potter was addressed to the cupboard. I knew from the moment the letters were generated. Snape looked at a point somewhere past Dumbledore's left shoulder. The silence in the office was the kind that had weight to it. When he spoke again, his voice was still level, still careful, still the voice of a man who had learned over many years and at considerable personal cost not to give anything away in the moment of hearing it. "And the blood protection," he said. "This is why you said nothing." Dumbledore recognized it as what it was. Not quite a question and not quite an accusation, but something occupying the space between them. He explained the mechanics, the bond of blood, the sacrificial protection Lily Potter had created in the act of dying, the way it had taken root in Petunia Dursley's act of taking the boy in. While Harry could call Privet Drive home, while Petunia remained his legal guardian and gave him shelter, the charm held. The moment that guardianship was severed, permanently and legally, the protection failed. And Voldemort, Dumbledore said, was not gone. He was diminished, greatly, but not gone. His followers were still present. His wraith persisted somewhere. An 11-year-old boy without the blood protection was not safe, and there was no other protection that Dumbledore could place on him with anything approaching the same strength. He said it without elaboration and without softening it and without excusing himself. He had made a calculation. The calculation had been, on its own terms, correct. He had never permitted himself to examine what it cost the boy to serve as the basis for a correct calculation. Snape stood. He picked up the gloves he had set on the arm of the chair when he sat down. The gesture, precise and unhurried. He put them in his coat pocket. He walked to the office door. He did not say anything further. He did not need to. His silence had the quality of a judgment delivered in a language that was below the threshold of words, and Dumbledore heard every syllable of it. The door closed quietly. On the desk, Arabella Figg's letter lay open beside the silver instrument, which kept turning, measuring nothing that mattered now. The small hours of the morning had a quality Dumbledore had come to know well over the course of a very long life, a particular quality of silence that was not peaceful, but merely emptied of distraction, so that whatever one had been avoiding thinking about in the daylight hours had nowhere left to go but directly forward. He sat at his desk with Arabella Figg's letter open before him and the first-year intake parchments arranged to one side, and he thought which was what the small hours required of him. He had, this evening, spoken to Severus Snape. He had explained the blood protection and its necessity and its cost, and Snape had left the office without speaking, which was its own kind of verdict. Dumbledore had watched the door close and had remained seated for some time before he was able to proceed to thinking about what came next. What came next was this: an accounting. He was good at accountings. He had performed them over a century of consequential decisions with the discipline of a man who believed that self-deception was the most dangerous form of deception available to him, and who therefore tried not to permit it. He had made in 1981 a calculation that the blood protection outweighed the cost of placing Harry Potter with the Dursleys. He had known, at the moment of making it, what the Dursleys were. He had had Minerva's assessment and his own observations from the 1st of November, when he had sat on the wall and watched the little family move behind their net curtains, and he had understood what lived in that house, the airlessness of it, the particular smallness of people who measured the world in terms of what they were allowed to look down upon, and he had placed a child in it anyway because the child needed to be alive more than he needed to be comfortable, and the blood protection could not be replicated by any other means. This was the accounting as it had always run. It balanced. The mathematics of it was sound. He looked at Figg's letter. Social workers came to number 4. They examined the cupboard. They are coming back. The handwriting was small and careful, the way people wrote when they had learned not to waste things. The cupboard. He had known about the cupboard since the 24th of July, 1991. Since the morning the first Hogwarts acceptance letter had written itself out in the enchantment's neat hand and been sorted into the packet for dispatch. He remembered it with perfect clarity, the way one sometimes remembered very small things that turned out to matter. He had seen the address. He had understood what a cupboard under the stairs contained when it was a child's bedroom. He had set the letter aside and moved on to the correspondence regarding the Hogwarts start-of-term arrangements. Mr. H. Potter, the cupboard under the stairs, 4 Privet Drive, Little Whinging, Surrey. He had read it. He had noted it. He had done nothing. The accounting, when he ran it again, now still balanced on its own terms. The blood protection required Harry to live with Petunia. It required Petunia to take him in as family, however grudgingly. It required Harry to be able to call Privet Drive home. Extracting the boy from the cupboard, contacting the Dursleys, demanding changes, threatening consequences, would have endangered the arrangement, endangered Petunia's grudging cooperation, endangered the whole careful structure. And so he had not done it. He had been correct about the mathematics, and he was sitting in his office in the small hours of an October morning, understanding, with a clarity that the daylight hours had not allowed him, that he had perhaps been wrong about everything else. McGonagall arrived at his office the following morning before he had finished breakfast, which was how she always arrived when something was on her mind. Directly, and without the formality of being summoned, she did not sit. She stood before his desk with her hands clasped and her expression arranged in the precise way that meant she had been thinking about something for longer than she intended to. "I need to speak with you about Harry Potter," she said. Dumbledore set down his cup. "Please, sit. I'd rather stand." She had been teaching Transfiguration for 35 years, and she had the posture to prove it. "I don't know what you know about his circumstances at home. I'm telling you what I've observed, which is a child who arrived at this school in clothing that was too large for him by several sizes, who flinches when a hand reaches across him unexpectedly, and who eats like someone who has learned not to take sufficiency for granted." She held his gaze without any of the ambiguity she sometimes permitted herself with him. Whatever those circumstances were, they were not acceptable. "No," Dumbledore said, "they were not." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "You know, I know considerably more than I have shared with you," he said. "Sit down, Minerva, and I will share it now." She sat. He told her about Fig, that she existed, that she had been placed on Wisteria Walk for this specific purpose, that he had received her letter a week ago. He told her about the social services visit to the Dursley house, about the follow-up visit that had been scheduled, about the referral that had originated at a Muggle secondary school whose name he did not yet know. He told her about the blood protection and what it required, using the same words he had used with Snape. Clearly, without softening, without any of the qualifications he sometimes deployed, when he wanted the truth to be heard, without being fully felt. McGonagall listened to all of it. Her hands were folded in her lap and her face was very still. When he had finished, she was quiet for long enough that the portraits above them began to stir and exchange glances. "I told you," she said at last, "on the night you left him there, that they were the worst kind of Muggles. You did. You told me what must be, must be. I did." The words sat between them in the morning air. She did not need to. She had been right in 1981, and then 10 years had passed, and she had not been wrong in the years between, and now there were social workers in Surrey documenting what she had told him 10 years ago, and there was very little that could be said about any of this, that the facts did not say better. "What do we do?" she said. And the shift, too, was something he noted and was grateful for, because he did not deserve the grace in it. He told her the practical situation. The Muggle investigation could reach the Dursleys. It could build a case against them. It could not reach Hogwarts. Directly, Hogwarts was unlocatable by any Muggle institution, whatever they were told the name of the school was. And the Dursleys would give investigators a name, if pressed, because a name proved the boy was in school and not in a ditch. The name would reach a dead end, where addresses ought to be. But it was possible that an official inquiry would attempt to contact the school by post, by some Muggle means, and if it did, it needed to receive a response that confirmed the boy was safe, enrolled, and cared for. "You would like me to draft that response," McGonagall said, "in your capacity as Deputy Headmistress, if and when the inquiry reaches us, and when Harry returns in the summer. To what does he return?" "I am working on that," Dumbledore said. "The arrangement will not remain as it was." She looked at him for a moment in the way she sometimes looked at him when she wanted to say something more, and had decided it could wait. "Very well," she said. "I'll draft a letter. Have it ready." She stood, straightened her robes, and moved to the door with the efficiency of a person who had a great deal to do and had not been improving the situation by sitting here. At the door she stopped. She did not turn around. 35 years ago, Albus, she said, you told me this school was for every child who came to it, that every child who arrived here was entitled to be safe here. He said nothing, because there was nothing to say. I am holding you to that, she said, and left. He sat alone in his office. The morning came in through the high windows and lay across the desk, and across Fig's letter, and across the bowl of sherbet lemons that had been replenished last week by a house elf who did not know his appetite for them had temporarily left him. He did not reach for one. He sat with his hands folded on the desk and the light moving across them, and tried to remember the last time mathematics had been sufficient. He could not. They came back on a Thursday, 3 weeks after the first visit, and this time there were 3 of them. Arabella Fig was sweeping her front path when the car pulled up, which was not a coincidence. She had been watching the street. She swept very slowly, and when one of the workers, the woman from the first visit, with the lanyard and the clipboard and the careful voice, came through her gate and introduced herself again and asked if Mrs. R. Fig had a few minutes. Arabella said that she did, and showed her through to the sitting room. She had thought about what she would say in the week since the first visit. She had thought about it carefully. There was a very great deal she knew about the boy at number 4, and the vast majority of it she could not say, because the vast majority of it came from sources that had no business existing as far as the woman with the lanyard was concerned. What she could say was what she had seen from her window, with her own eyes, over 10 years of watching a street. She had very good reasons to watch. She had seen the boy in the kitchen window. He was small for his age, and he stood on something, a step, a stool, to reach the cooker, and this had been the case for several years, long before standing on a stool to reach a cooker was any child's normal responsibility. She had seen him in the back garden in all seasons doing the things that needed doing. In a back garden, weeding, sweeping, clearing leaves in autumn. She had seen his clothes, which were very large, and none of them his. She said all of this, and she said it plainly, and she did not editorialize because she did not need to. The worker wrote it down. She had the kind of handwriting that moved quickly without losing precision, and she did not look up while she wrote, and when she had finished, she asked whether Mrs. Fig had ever spoken to the boy directly. "He used to spend time with me," Arabella said, when his aunt and uncle needed someone to look after him. "We watched the television, and I showed him photographs. He was a polite child. Quiet." She paused. "Very quiet." The worker wrote that down too, and thanked her, and went back up the path. Petunia Dursley had been preparing for this visit since the last one. She had thought carefully about every question she might be asked, and the precise, true, inarguable answer to each. She sat at the kitchen table across from 2 of the workers. The third was somewhere else in the house, which she did not allow herself to think about, and she folded her hands and spoke in the voice she used for the school governor's meetings, pleasant, articulate, leaving nothing opening onto further inquiry. The boy had been given accommodations appropriate to the space available at the time. The cupboard was large as cupboards went, and had been the most practical option during certain years when their living arrangements had not permitted a spare bedroom to be dedicated to a guest child. She was aware that it did not sound ideal. It had not been ideal. They had remedied the situation the moment circumstances permitted. The boy had been given responsibilities appropriate to his age and to the household's needs. Children benefited from contributing to the running of a home. She herself had had responsibilities at his age. He had been clothed. He had been fed. The workers wrote down what she said. One of them also wrote down from time to time observations that Petunia could not see from her side of the table, notes about the way she held her hands perfectly still, and the way her syntax never loosened, not even slightly, and the particular quality of her composure, which was not the composure of someone who had nothing to hide, but the composure of someone who had prepared very carefully for the specific shape of what she might be asked. They asked about Harry's birthday. Petunia said, of course it was celebrated. He had a birthday in July. They were well aware. They asked her to describe one. She described Dudley's birthday because Dudley's birthday was in June, and the question had been about July, and she was a precise woman, and she began to say so, and then she stopped, and began again. The boy's birthday, she said, was the 31st of July. Last July, he had received... She paused. She thought. The pause was not long. It was not dramatic. It was simply the pause of a person who did not have the information that a pause of that length implied they did not have. She said he had received appropriate gifts. They asked, what gifts? Specifically, she said she would have to check. They wrote down that she would have to check. They wrote down the pause. They wrote down the change in her voice when Dudley's birthday was mentioned, and the change when Harry's birthday was mentioned, which were two different changes of two different kinds. The interview ended shortly after. Petunia showed them out. She stood in the kitchen after the front door closed and the sound of the car faded, and she was entirely still for a long moment, the way she had been still in the hallway after the first visit, the way she was sometimes still in the kitchen in the evenings after Vernon had gone to bed. The stillness of a woman who was holding something that kept being heavier than she had calculated it would be. In the third-floor office of a Surrey County Council building, a folder was getting thicker. It held now the original safeguarding referral from Smeltings Academy. Photographs taken during the first visit, the cupboard, the bed, the two locks, the marks on the door, the typed notes from the first interview, the notes from the neighbor consultation, including Arabella Figg of Wisteria Walk, the notes from today's interview, with two observations underlined in pencil by the caseworker who had been taking notes, the pause, and the phrase appropriate gifts. At the back of the folder, a formal assessment was being drafted, and a formal recommendation was taking shape behind it, and both of them were moving slowly and steadily in a direction that could not be undone. At Hogwarts, Harry sat at the Gryffindor table at supper and worked through a second helping of something with pastry on top of it. It was very good. Most things at Hogwarts were very good in a way that he was still in the process of getting used to in the sense of no longer bracing each time for the plate to be taken away or the quantity to be revised downward. He was learning that enough was a condition that could persist, that it was not a mistake, that he was not using more than his share. The learning was slower than he would have expected if he had thought to expect it, which he had not. He had not known there was anything to learn. He ate his supper and did not know that his past was in a folder in an office 200 miles south of him, accumulating weight. The letter arrived by Muggle post, which was the first indication that something unusual was happening, because Muggle post did not, as a general rule, arrive at Hogwarts. It was addressed to Hogwarts School for Gifted Children, Scotland, which was not quite right on 3 counts: the full name, the category, and the fact that Scotland was all the address contained, since Hogwarts had no address that the Muggle postal system could resolve. The castle had been there for 1,000 years without requiring a postcode, and did not intend to acquire one. Nevertheless, the envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning in November, in the pile that the school's forwarding arrangement in London routed through. McGonagall found it among the official correspondence and brought it to Dumbledore's office without opening it. He read it while she stood. His expression did not change while he read, which she had learned to interpret over many years as a sign that he was reading something that confirmed what he had already known. He set it down when he had finished and said, "They want verification that Harry Potter is enrolled here and that someone in an official capacity has spoken with him. Can you give them that?" "I can give them the first without difficulty. The second is a conversation I have been expecting to have with Harry for some time. I suppose this accelerates the timeline." He reached for a fresh sheet of parchment. "Would you give us an hour first, Minerva, before I speak to him?" She left him to write his reply. When he composed it was brief and exact. It confirmed that Harry James Potter was enrolled as a first-year student at Hogwarts, that he was in good health and under the full care of the school's staff for the duration of term, and that the school took its pastoral responsibilities with the utmost seriousness. It confirmed that the headmaster, Albus Dumbledore, was available for further correspondence and requested that any future contact be directed to him specifically. It noted that an in-person meeting with the student could be arranged at the appropriate time and that the school would cooperate fully with any legitimate welfare process. It contained a great deal that was not said. He sent it that afternoon by the means that the forwarding arrangement used in reverse, and then he sent a note to Professor McGonagall asking her to locate Harry Potter at her earliest convenience and send him to the headmaster's office. McGonagall found Harry in the corridor outside the Charms classroom after the lunch period. He was walking with one shoulder slightly ahead of the other, which she had noticed was how he moved through corridors when he was thinking about something. Not anxious exactly, but provisional, the way you moved when you had learned that corridors sometimes contained unexpected changes of plan. She said, "Mr. Potter, the headmaster would like a word." His expression went through something very quick. She catalogued it, the initial contraction, the involuntary assessment of what he had done wrong. And then, something she had not expected, a brief and almost startled second thought. As though the idea that a summons to authority might not be a summons to consequence was an idea that had just occurred to him for the first time, and he wasn't sure yet whether to trust it. "Of course," he said. "Now, he's free this afternoon." Harry nodded and turned and went toward the stairs without any of the dawdling that some of the first years performed when they were hoping to be told more before they arrived. She watched him go and thought, "This is what it looks like, a child who has learned that knowing more in advance does not help." Dumbledore's office had the quality of a room that knew things. Harry had not been in it before. It had a fire going and portraits on the walls that watched him come in with the attentiveness of people who had been waiting in the same spot for a long time and were accustomed to finding this worthwhile. Dumbledore was standing behind his desk rather than sitting at it, which Harry did not know was unusual. "Sit down, Harry." He sat. He put his hands in his lap, and he was very still in the way. He was still when he was paying close attention. Dumbledore sat. He folded his hands on the desk, and he looked at Harry across them. And he said, "I need to tell you something that has been happening since September, something in the Muggle world, involving your family. I want to tell you what I know, and I want to tell it to you in the order it happened, so that it is clear," Harry said. "All right," Dumbledore told him. He told him about Smeltings Academy, about a first-day exercise, about a teacher asking students to share something about their home lives. He told him that Dudley had spoken about the cupboard under the stairs, that he had described it to a classroom of other 11-year-olds as something amusing, the way you described a peculiarity of your family that you expected others to find as unremarkable as you did. He told him that the teacher had not found it unremarkable. He told him about the safeguarding referral, the social services contact, the welfare visit to 4 Privet Drive. He told him the workers had examined the cupboard. He told him they had been building a case since September, that they had spoken to neighbors, that they had conducted a formal interview with his aunt, and that they had now written to Hogwarts asking for confirmation that Harry was in school and under care. Harry listened to all of it. He did not move. His hands stayed where they were. When Dumbledore had finished, Harry was quiet for a moment. Then he asked, "Does Dudley know what he started?" It was the first question. Not what happens to me, not what does this mean, not what did I do. Does Dudley know? "I don't believe so," Dumbledore said. "From what I understand of the situation, he was describing your circumstances in a social context. He said what he said without understanding the consequences. He may still not understand them. He sat with it for a moment in the way he sat with things not performing thought, just doing it, somewhere behind his eyes. Then he said, 'Was it not normal?' Dumbledore was quiet. 'The cupboard,' Harry said, and his voice was flat in the way that came from genuine inquiry, rather than from anger. 'The cooking, all of it. I always thought that was just how things were. Normal children don't have social workers visiting their families. So either something has gone wrong at their end, or something was wrong at mine.' He looked at Dumbledore. His green eyes behind the round glasses were clear and serious, and asking a real question. 'Which is it?' Dumbledore said. It was not normal. He did not say anything else. Not yet. There were other things, the letters, the address, 10 years of knowing and calculating and saying nothing, that were waiting in the room like furniture, waiting to be moved, and they would need to be moved, but not today. For now, what Harry needed was the one clean sentence, without its history. "No," Dumbledore said, because Harry was still looking at him. "None of it was normal, and I am sorry it took this long for someone to say so directly." Harry looked at him for a moment. Then he looked at the desk between them. Then he said, "Thank you," in the particular way of someone who has received information that needs to settle before it becomes a feeling. He stood. He said goodbye. He went out. The corridor outside the headmaster's office was empty, it being the middle of the afternoon and everyone else in class. Harry walked to the end of it and stopped. He put his back against the stone wall and stood there. Below him, somewhere in the castle, a lesson was going on. The muffled sounds of teaching, a voice he didn't recognize, a door somewhere he could hear it. He stood in the quiet of the corridor, and he was very still. He did not go back to class for a while. He was not crying, and he was not angry, and he did not know what he was, which might have been the most honest response available to someone who had just been told that 11 years of his life had been one thing when he had always believed them to be another. He stood in the corridor, and the afternoon light came through the far window and lay across the stone floor, and he breathed and thought and could not yet find the shape of what he was trying to think. He would go to class in a moment. He stood there a little longer first. It was in the library that it occurred to him between the shelves, with a book about counter-jinxes half open in his hands, and Ron Weasley 3 rows over, looking for something about chess strategies, and the thing that occurred to him was this. Not only that the letters had come. He had known about the letters since the summer, the way they had arrived in dozens, in hundreds, the way his uncle had intercepted them and burned them, and boarded up the letterbox. And still they had come, through the cracks and the eggs, and finally through the front door, in a torrent on a Sunday morning. He had known all of that. What he had not thought about until this moment, standing in the library 4 days after Dumbledore had told him it was not normal, was the address. The letters had been addressed to him. Specifically, "At the cupboard, Mr. H. Potter, the cupboard under the stairs, which meant the school had known. The school had known where he slept. Someone at Hogwarts had known, before the letters were written, that Harry Potter was living in a cupboard under a staircase. They had written to him there. Not to a bedroom. Not to a spare room. They had known, and they had written, and then what? What happened after you wrote to a child at the cupboard address and the child wrote back and arrived at your school, thin and in oversized clothes with a scar and 11 years of a particular kind of history behind him? What did you think had been happening in the cupboard while the school years went by and the letters were never addressed anywhere else? He stood in the library with the counterjinx book and thought about this until it was too large to stay inside his head without doing something with it. Then he put the book back on the wrong shelf by mistake and went to find Dumbledore's office without being summoned. The gargoyle moved aside for him, which was either a coincidence or wasn't. He climbed the spiral stairs and knocked. "Come in," said Dumbledore. He was at his desk with his half-moon spectacles pushed up above his eyes and a long sheaf of correspondence in his hand, and he set it down when he saw Harry come in, without marking his place, which was the kind of thing Harry was only just beginning to learn to notice, the gesture that said, "You are more important than what I was doing." "Harry," he said, "sit down." Harry sat. He kept his hands in his lap. He said, "The letters in the summer. They were addressed to me at the cupboard." Dumbledore did not pretend to misunderstand him. "Yes," he said. "So the school knew where I was sleeping. The Hogwarts enchantments write the address automatically," Dumbledore said. "Based on where the student is living, the letters address themselves. They don't require a person to know. They write what is true." Harry held this for a moment. "But you see them?" "I see them. So you knew." "Yes," Dumbledore said. "I knew." The portraits of former headmasters watched from the walls with the attention of people who had been in similar rooms for a very long time. The spindly silver instrument on the desk turned on its axis. Harry sat with his hands in his lap and looked at Dumbledore across the desk, and Dumbledore looked back at him, and neither of them looked away. "I think," Harry said carefully, "that you should tell me why." Dumbledore removed his spectacles. He turned them over once in his hands, which Harry had not seen him do before, and set them on the desk. "Yes," he said. "I think so too." He told Harry about his mother. He told him about Lily Potter, who had been 21 years old when she died, who had died specifically in the act of choosing to die for her son, which was not simply a fact about the night in question. Lily Potter's death had created a protection, ancient, powerful, rooted in a magic that required love of a particular kind, the willing, self-annihilating kind, to work. It had reflected Voldemort's curse back upon him and had nearly destroyed him. But it had not simply evaporated after that night. The protection had taken root. It had rooted itself in the nearest living person who shared Lily's blood, Petunia Dursley Nee Evans, Lily's sister, the only family Harry had. When Petunia had taken Harry into her house in November 1981, unwillingly, Dumbledore said, without softening this, she had activated a charm, something called the Bond of Blood. War. The charm created a circle of protection, as long as Harry could call that house home. As long as Petunia remained his legal guardian and gave him shelter, the charm held. While you can still call home the place where your mother's blood dwells, the charm said, there you cannot be touched or harmed by Voldemort. And Voldemort, Dumbledore said, was not gone. He was greatly diminished, dispersed perhaps in hiding. His followers remained. His wraith persisted somewhere in the world. An 11-year-old Harry Potter, without the blood protection, was not invisible to the people who would want to find him. A blood protection was the only charm Dumbledore knew of that could be placed on Harry with anything approaching that strength, and it required the Dursley house and Petunia's guardianship, and Harry's ability to call it home. He said all of this clearly, without softening the mathematics and without softening the cost. He did not say, and that is why I made the decision I made, and therefore it was correct. He just said the facts. He laid them out, and he said them, and he stopped. Harry listened to all of it. He understood it. The magical world had its own rules, and he had been learning them for 3 weeks, and this was one of the rules, and it was internally consistent, and he believed it. He sat with it for a long moment after Dumbledore had finished. Then he said, "But you still knew." Dumbledore waited. "You knew where I was sleeping," Harry said, "and you knew what was happening there, or you could have found out, and you didn't." He was not angry. His voice had the same flat quality it had had when he asked, was it not normal, the quality of genuine thought rather than feeling, though the feeling was underneath it, still finding its shape. You did the maths, you worked out that the protection mattered more than whatever was happening in the cupboard, and that's... I think I even understand that. I think you're probably right, that I needed to be alive. He paused. "But you never asked," he said. "In 10 years, nobody from this school ever wrote to the cupboard and asked if I was all right. The letters came. They said, 'You're invited to Hogwarts.' They didn't say, 'Are you being treated properly?' They didn't say, 'We can see where you're sleeping, and we'd like to know how you are.'" He looked at Dumbledore. His green eyes behind his round glasses were direct, and held something that was not accusation, but was worse than accusation, in the way that clear-eyed disappointment is always worse. Dumbledore did not say that he had believed the Dursleys would come around in time, because Harry would have recognized it as the thing it was. He did not say that the mathematics had seemed sound, because mathematics is not an answer to a child asking if anyone thought to wonder how he was. He said, "No, I did not ask." Harry looked at him for a moment longer. Then he stood, and he said that he had better get back, and he went out. McGonagall was in the anteroom. She had come up the spiral stairs a few minutes before with a note from the solicitor's office in London. A second letter had arrived. The inquiry was progressing. She had intended to brief Dumbledore, and had heard the voice from inside the office, and sat down to wait without intending to listen, because the room was not large, and the voice was not quiet. She had heard Harry's voice, asking its question in the particular flat tone of someone who had thought about something very carefully before saying it, and she had heard what he said, and she had heard the answer. She saw Harry's face when he came out of the office. He looked at her, and she looked at him, and she did not say anything, and he did not say anything, and then he went down the spiral stairs, and was gone. She went into the office. Dumbledore was sitting at his desk. He had his spectacles back on, though there was nothing in front of him on the desk. He looked up when she came in. She stood in the doorway for a moment. She said, "I told you in 1981 that they were the worst kind of muggles." "You did," he said. "I should have told you again," she said, "in 1982. In 1983. In every year thereafter. I should have walked into this office every September and said it again until something was done about it." She closed the door behind her. She sat down in the chair across from his desk. Outside the high windows, the November sky was the color of pewter, and the lake below was still, and the grounds were quiet in the way of things that had been there a long time and would be there long after. He did not reach for the bowl of sherbet lemons on his desk. He did not reach for it, and neither of them mentioned it, and the afternoon moved around them like water. The formal assessment of the Dursley household was dated the 14th of November and ran to 19 pages. The language in it was careful in the way that institutional language was careful. Weighted, qualified, grounded in what could be observed and evidenced rather than what the caseworker had felt while she was writing it. What it said, stripped of its careful language, was this: a child had been housed in a cupboard under the staircase of a private residence for approximately 10 years, beginning before he could have been old enough to object or to understand what he was being deprived of. He had been assigned domestic responsibilities, cooking, gardening, household cleaning, that were disproportionate to his age, and carried out without compensation or ordinary acknowledgement. He had been clothed in garments that did not fit him. He had been told, without any apparent support or elaboration, that both of his parents were dead, killed in a motor vehicle accident, and he had been actively discouraged from asking questions about them or about the circumstances of their deaths. The assessment noted that the child was now in full-time secondary education at an institution in Scotland, appeared to be in good health, and was reported by the school to be settled and doing well. It noted that this positive development did not diminish the evidence of what had occurred in the preceding decade. It recommended that the matter be placed before a family court panel to determine appropriate action, including whether the current guardianship arrangement should be reviewed, whether supervision conditions should be imposed, and what consideration should be given to the child's welfare during school holidays. The folder was now very thick. At Smeltings Academy, a letter from his mother arrived for Dudley Dursley on a Tuesday morning. He read it at breakfast, between a third helping of scrambled eggs and a fourth piece of toast. It said that she hoped he was keeping up with his lessons and eating properly. It said that his father sent his love. It said that things at home were perfectly fine, and he was not to worry. It did not say anything about what had happened in September, or what had happened since, or that Dudley's name appeared in an official document as the individual whose disclosure had initiated a formal social services investigation into the household he had grown up in. He wrote back that afternoon. He said he was eating very well and that Smeltings was brilliant and he had got top marks on a geography quiz. He sealed the envelope and thought no more about it. He was having a fine time. In Little Whinging, Surrey, the kitchen at 4 Privet Drive, Ive was quiet after midnight. Vernon was asleep. Petunia had not been sleeping well for several weeks and had stopped pretending to, and she sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea she hadn't touched and a piece of writing paper and a pen. She had been sitting there for 20 minutes. She was going to write a letter. She had decided this sometime around 11 o'clock, and she had not undeceived herself since, which meant she was going to do it and would feel better once she had, because Petunia Dursley had learned, over the course of a long and controlled life, that the things she had decided to do, she had decided not to let Lily's odd, magic-infested world into her house in 1981, and then a baby had been left on her doorstep with a letter, and she had known at once what the letter would say and had sat with it in the dark for a long time. She had decided not to think about what the arrangement meant, not ever again after she had made it, and she had spent 10 years very successfully not thinking about it. And then a social worker had stood in her kitchen and asked about birthday gifts, and she had been unable for the first time in a decade to find the answer. She had been outmaneuvered, not by the social workers. She had known they were coming, had prepared for them, had given them nothing that was not technically true. She had been outmaneuvered by the year 1991, by a September morning at Smeltings that she had not been present for and could not have anticipated and could not undo. Dudley had said a thing in a classroom without knowing what he was saying, and the thing was now 19 pages in a government document. She picked up the pen. She wrote, Professor A. Dumbledore, Headmaster, Hogwarts School. She paused with the pen above the page. She did not write a street address, because she knew, had always known, in the way you know things about a world you have spent 30 years refusing to acknowledge, that a letter addressed to Dumbledore would reach Dumbledore. It had always worked the other way. The magical world found you when it wanted to. She had no reason to believe it had become less capable of this. She wrote, "I am writing about my nephew." She crossed out my nephew and wrote the boy, and then crossed that out too, and wrote Harry, because whatever she thought about the circumstances, this was not the moment for euphemism. She wrote, "I am writing about Harry. I understand there are difficulties. I need to speak with you. I am aware of what the arrangement between us has meant. I have kept it for 10 years. I kept it because I understood why it was necessary, and because Lily," she stopped. She looked at what she had written. She crossed out, "and because Lily," and wrote, "and I'm asking you now to help me keep it. Whatever consequences are coming, I am asking you to help me manage them in a way that does not end the arrangement." She folded the letter. She put it in an envelope and addressed it and sealed it. She set it on the kitchen table. She did not go to the post office the next morning. She had a feeling, based on nothing she could have cited in a social services interview, that the letter would not require the post office. By what mechanism it left the kitchen table she did not witness, but when she came downstairs at 7, the envelope was gone. At Hogwarts, the letter arrived at breakfast in the claws of an owl that had the look of something that had been flying for a while and had views about it. Dumbledore took it from the owl. The bird submitted to this grudgingly and set it beside his orange juice and read it once, and then turned it over and read it again from the beginning, which was unusual. He read quickly, as a general rule. Letters rarely needed 2 passes. He sat with it for a moment. Then he set it down and looked out the high windows of the great hall at the grey November morning and the lake below it, and the grounds going bare and brown with the season, and he was quiet for a little longer than the portraits on the walls, considered strictly necessary. And then he called for a quill and ink and wrote a reply on the back of a piece of student correspondence he had already dealt with, because it was what was nearest to hand. His reply said, "I will come." He sent it the same evening. He had been to Privet Drive once before, on a cold November night 10 years ago, and the street looked almost exactly the same net curtains, the same identical doors, the same arrangement of cars, on the same arrangement of driveways, and the sodium lights making everything the same amber color, and the closed, self-contained quality of a road that wanted nothing to happen in it. He had sat on the wall at the end of that night and watched a baby sleep in a basket and set down a letter and walked away. And number 4 had looked in the dark exactly as it looked now in the early evening. A house like every other house, containing things that no one on this street suspected. He had dressed for the occasion in the sense that he had left his robes at Hogwarts. He wore a long coat, dark, unremarkable from a distance, though if you looked at it closely, the buttons were a slightly unusual shape, and boots. And he had tucked his hair under a hat that was perhaps not the hat a Muggle would have chosen. He was very tall, and had very long silver hair and a very crooked nose, and no hat was going to resolve all of that. But he had made a reasonable effort. He rang the bell at number 4 at 7:15 on a Thursday evening. Vernon Dursley opened the door. He was a large man, broad across the shoulders, with a thick, dark mustache and almost no neck, and he had the expression of someone who had been told to expect something alarming and had deployed his face in the direction of ordinary pleasantness as a precaution. For a moment, the two of them stood in the doorway, Vernon Dursley, in his shirt sleeves, with his hand on the doorframe, and the oldest living wizard in Britain with his hat tucked under one arm, and Vernon could not find a way to make this situation ordinary, and Dumbledore did not try to help him. "Professor Dumbledore," Vernon said. "Mr. Dursley," Dumbledore said. "Thank you for having me." Vernon stepped back. Dumbledore went in. The house was warm and smelled of something that had been cooking earlier. Vernon showed him to the kitchen, or rather led him in that direction, and Dumbledore followed, because he remembered, very specifically, the layout of this house from the night he had stood outside it and thought about what it would mean for the boy. The hallway, the staircase on the right, the door beneath the staircase, which he walked past without looking at, and did not need to look at. Petunia Dursley was standing at the counter. She was thin, fair-haired, with the particular precise posture of a woman who had learned early that how you stood communicated as much as anything you said. She looked at Dumbledore when he came in with an expression that had been arranged very carefully, and that he recognized, from a long experience of people arranging their expressions in his presence, as the expression of someone who had been preparing for this meeting since the moment they posted the letter. "Vernon," she said, "would you wait in the sitting room?" Vernon, who clearly had a number of views about this instruction, compressed his mustache briefly and went. Petunia sat at the kitchen table. Dumbledore sat across from her. The kitchen was clean and orderly, and from where he sat, if he had turned his head to the left by perhaps 40 degrees, he would have been looking directly at the cupboard door under the stairs. The latch was new. The whole door had been replastered at some point in the last few months, the marks sanded down and the paintwork refreshed, but it was still a cupboard door, and it was still there. Neither of them mentioned it. Both of them were aware of it. "I wrote to you," Petunia said, "because I need to understand what I am supposed to do." "Yes," Dumbledore said. "There is a court hearing in 6 weeks. They are going to look at the history of this household and make a determination about Harry's welfare and possibly about my fitness as a guardian." She said this with the same careful precision she had used with the social workers, with none of the composure that sometimes broke at the edges when she was not prepared. She had been prepared for this conversation since November. "I cannot allow that process to go anywhere near what I know. There are things about that boy's history that cannot be put in front of a family court judge. I took him in because I understood what was necessary. I kept the arrangement for 10 years. I am not going to be the one who unravels it by letting a magistrate start asking the wrong questions." Dumbledore looked at her across the kitchen table and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "I cannot make the investigation disappear." She looked at him steadily. "That process," he said, "is a just one. People who do their jobs well identified something that warranted investigation, and they investigated it, and what they found warranted a formal response. I will not perform any magic that interferes with that process. I want to be entirely clear about this." Petunia's hands were folded on the table. They did not move. "What I can do," Dumbledore said, "is this. Harry will return to this house in the summer. The legal guardianship arrangement will continue. He will remain your ward in every formal and official sense that matters, and the blood protection will remain intact, and Voldemort and those who serve him will not be able to reach him here." He paused. "In exchange for this, and I am using the word exchange deliberately, because I want to be clear that I am asking something of you in return, not only offering something, you will ensure that when Harry comes back, there is a room for him. A room with a door that is not locked from the outside. He will be given food in the quantities a growing child requires. He will be given clothes that fit him. He will not be assigned the running of this household. He will not be required to cook and garden and clean in exchange for being housed here. He let this settle. I am not asking you to love him, he said. I understand that I have no standing to ask you that, and I don't believe it would be useful to ask. I'm not asking you to be warm toward him, or to treat him as Dudley is treated, or to pretend that his presence here is anything other than what it has always been. I am asking you to stop causing him harm. These are different things, and only one of them is within my right to require. Petunia said nothing for a long moment. Then she stood and put the kettle on. She set 2 cups on the table and poured the tea when it was ready, and sat back down. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the street went about its business. Somewhere up the road, a car reversed on a driveway and the sound faded. The silence between them was not comfortable, but it was specific. It had the quality of something that had been agreed to without the agreement being stated, because stating it would have required both of them to name what they were agreeing to, and neither of them, for different reasons. She did not say yes. She did not need to. After a while she asked, "Does the boy know why he was left here?" "I told him," Dumbledore said, "about the blood protection. About what his mother's death created, and what you're taking him in preserved." She looked at her tea. "Does he know about Lily?" "He's beginning to," Dumbledore said. She was quiet again. He watched her, the particular stillness of her, and thought, not for the first time, and with the same weight he had been carrying for the better part of 3 months, that she had done what she had done in 1981. She had taken the boy in grudgingly, furiously, unwillingly, as the letter he had left had asked her to, and in doing so she had sealed the charm he had placed. But there were other things in that decision, things that went back farther than 1981, back to 2 sisters and a word on a train platform and 30 years of a wound that had never been permitted to close. He did not say any of this. It was not his to say, and she would not have received it if he had tried. He put on his coat and thanked her for the tea. She showed him to the door. He stood on the pavement outside number 4 and looked at the house for a moment. The sitting room light was on, and he could see, through the net curtains, the vague shape of Vernon Dursley waiting. The kitchen light was still on. The house sat in the street, exactly as it had always sat, giving nothing away. He walked away. The family court hearing lasted 40 minutes and produced a document of 14 pages. The Dursleys would not face criminal charges. What they would face was a child protection plan, effective immediately, to be reviewed every 3 months and monitored by a caseworker for the duration of Harry Potter's minority. The conditions were stated plainly: adequate sleeping accommodation in a proper bedroom with a lockable door to which the child had his own key, clothing appropriate to his size and age, purchased new or in reasonable condition, no assignment of domestic labor beyond what was considered age-appropriate contribution to a shared household, and a clear distinction drawn between that and the service that had been evidenced. Harry would return to 4 Privet Drive. In the summer, the court was satisfied that a proper placement was available. The file was not closed. It was placed under review, but the immediate recommendation had been fulfilled. The magical world was not mentioned. The family court judge did not know it existed. The caseworker had noted in her file that Harry's boarding school in Scotland had confirmed he was enrolled and in good health and under proper care, and she had not pursued it further, because everything the school had confirmed had turned out to be true, and the court had more pressing concerns. The folder was thick and would remain open for the foreseeable future, but the worst of what it contained had been acknowledged and addressed, and that was what a just process looked like from the outside. Professor McGonagall called Harry to her office on a Monday afternoon in December. He came in the same way he had come to Dumbledore's office in October, carefully, with the rapid, involuntary assessment of what he might have done wrong, and then the second thought, slower now but arriving more reliably than it had before, that a summons didn't necessarily mean a punishment. He was getting better at the second thought. It still required effort, but it came. She told him the outcome clearly, and without preamble. The investigation had concluded. A child protection plan had been imposed. Conditions had been specified. He would have a bedroom when he returned in the summer, a room with a door. He sat with this for a moment. He had a habit of sitting with things before he responded to them, which she had come to recognize as considered rather than slow. The habit of someone who had learned that what came out of your mouth, when you hadn't thought about it first, sometimes made things worse. "A door that isn't locked?" he said. "Yes," she said. "A door that is not locked from the outside." He nodded. Then he said, "Was that always possible?" "Giving me a room instead of the cupboard?" Minerva McGonagall had spent 35 years teaching transfiguration, which was the practice of changing the fundamental nature of a thing, and she had become very good at it. And she sat behind her desk now and understood that she was being asked a question she had no good answer to, elements and inadequate as a whole. She said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "It should have been." Harry looked at her for a long moment with his green eyes and his round glasses and the scar on his forehead, and then he nodded again once and thanked her for telling him, and left. She watched the door close. She sat in her office for some time after he had gone. Severus Snape had not spoken to Harry Potter about any of it. He had not spoken to him about anything that was not potions, correction of his wand angle, assessment of his essay, the occasional cutting observation about the precise manner in which his potion differed from what it was supposed to be. He taught 3 sections of first years every week, and Harry Potter sat in the 3rd row at the end and worked with the focused, braced attention of someone who had decided that being corrected was better than being unnoticed. And Snape had observed this with the part of his attention he did not permit to be visible, and had said nothing about it. He had also been observing, for the better part of 2 months, how the boy ate. He had not wanted to observe this. He had not, strictly speaking, permitted himself to observe it, and yet there it was in the evidence that the Great Hall provided every morning and evening, laid out for anyone who was paying attention. Harry Potter ate with the particular and specific efficiency of a child who had learned, at some point in his formation, not to waste the opportunity of a meal. He ate quickly. He ate to completion. Always. Everything on his plate, in a way that looked less like enjoyment than like the fulfillment of a task that might be interrupted. He ate a second helping when it was available, and he did not reach for it until after everyone around him had had the chance to take one first, which was the kind of politeness that was not really politeness, but accommodation. Snape had watched a great deal of Quidditch in his life, from both sides of a broomstick. He knew what it looked like when a person moved in permanent anticipation of loss. In the 2nd week of November, on a Tuesday evening, he walked to the basement corridor and stood in front of the large painting of a bowl of fruit. He reached out and tickled the pear in the painted bowl. The pear wriggled and giggled and became a door handle, and he opened the door and went into the Hogwarts kitchens. The kitchens were large and warm and smelled of everything that had ever been cooked in them. Duns of house elves moved between the long tables and the copper pots, with the efficiency of people who had been doing this for a very long time and found it satisfying. Several of them looked up when he came in. One of them, wearing a towel knotted at the shoulder, approached him with the expression of a person very pleased to receive a visitor in their professional domain. Snape said he wished to make a request about one of the first-year students. The elf waited, attentive. He said he would like Harry Potter's evening meals to include an additional serving of protein, meat, eggs, whatever was available, in addition to the standard serving. The elf said that they were happy to accommodate requests of this kind and thanked him for asking politely and asked if there was anything else he required. There was nothing else. He went back to his own dinner via the corridor and the staircase and the dark passage that ran behind the first-floor classroom, and he did not mention it to anyone, and the record of the arrangement existed nowhere except in the kitchen's own informal accounting of what each student preferred. Harry never knew. He noticed sometime in December that his evening meals seemed to include more of the things that stuck, the meat pies, the roasted chicken, the dense bean stews, and concluded that the kitchen did this by rotation. He ate what was given and was grateful without knowing to whom, which was, from the point of view of the person who had made the arrangement, precisely the intended outcome. The term moved on in the way that first terms moved on, dense with the specific weight of many new things arriving at once. There were charms and transfiguration and herbology and double potions on Fridays. There were flying lessons on the lawn in autumn, the brooms rising unsteadily into the cold air, and Harry had discovered on the first lesson to his own surprise that flying was the one thing he had done in his life that he was good at without effort or anxiety, that got into his hands immediately, as though it had been waiting there. There was a first-year Gryffindor Quidditch position as a consequence of this, which Ron had called brilliant, and which Harry found he agreed with, in a way he couldn't quite account for, the way you agreed with things that happened to you that matched something you hadn't known you needed. The defense against the dark arts classroom was on the 3rd floor, and the professor who taught in it that year was a man who seemed permanently unwell and kept his classroom rather colder than it needed to be. Harry attended and took notes and passed the assessments and found the subject interesting in the abstract way. He found most things interesting as information, as a map of what the world contained. He did not know, because he had no reason to know, that the classroom was also the locus of a separate and more urgent drama running on a track parallel to his own. He was 11 years old and had enough to think about. In the Gryffindor common room, on a Thursday night at the end of November, Harry sat at the desk by the window with his homework journal open and a quill in his hand. The fire was going. Ron was playing chess by himself in the armchair and losing, which Ron said was good practice. Harry had a potions essay to write on the properties of armadillo bile, and he had not started it. He wrote in the homework journal, "My name is Harry Potter, and I used to live in a cupboard," and he stopped. He looked at the word "and." He was not sure what came after it. He had been not sure for several weeks, since the afternoon in Dumbledore's office, and the afternoon in McGonagall's office, and the various other afternoons in between, when he had stood somewhere in the castle carrying what he now knew. Whatever came after, and he didn't have it yet. He wasn't sure that, and was even the right word. He wasn't sure it was the right structure. Some things did not have an "and." He crossed out the sentence from beginning to end. He turned to a fresh page and wrote at the top, "Potions essay. The properties of armadillo bile." He began. The Hogwarts Express left Hogsmeade Station at 11 o'clock on the last morning of June, and moved south through the hills and then through the lowlands and then through the long flat midland afternoon, and Harry sat in a compartment with Ron Weasley and watched the world through the window, which had become a habit in the past year. Ron was asleep against the window with his mouth slightly open and his red hair pushed up on one side where he'd been leaning, and the chessboard between them had the particular settled look of a game where one player had clearly won and the other had conceded about 20 minutes ago. Harry had conceded. He always conceded to Ron at chess, partly because Ron was genuinely much better, and partly because losing to Ron at chess was one of the more pleasant things that had happened to him in the last 12 months, which was a sentence he had never expected to be true about anything involving losing. He had a trunk in the rack above him. He had a wand in his pocket, which he was still not allowed to use outside school. He had 1 year of Hogwarts behind him, which contained transfiguration and charms and the smell of potions and the enchanted ceiling and the library and the flying and the warmth and the food especially, and Ron's laugh, and the particular quality of the Gryffindor common room at night when everyone else had gone to bed and the fire had burned down to embers and the portraits dozed in their frames. He had all of that. He also had the knowledge that the school had written to him at the cupboard and that the headmaster had known, the knowledge that his mother had died to protect him, the knowledge that the protection required him to go back. He had been told all of it by the people who had decided it, and he had understood it, and he was still in the process of deciding what you were supposed to do with understanding when it arrived this way, not chosen, but delivered in someone else's office, as part of a calculation that had been performed on your behalf without your knowledge for a decade. He looked at the fields going past, and let the train carry him south. He had both things, the year and what he knew, and he was getting used to the weight of having both at once, which was not the same as the weight getting lighter. The taxi from the station turned onto Privet Drive at 4:30 in the afternoon. Harry looked at the street through the window as it came into view. The uniform houses, the identical front gardens, the net curtains, the precise arrangement of it all. It looked exactly as it had always looked. It looked like a street that was very proud of being a street and had no intention of being anything else. He had spent 10 years believing this street was the whole of the world available to him, and he had been wrong about that, and the street did not seem to know or care that he had been wrong about it. He paid the driver and carried his trunk to the door of number 4. Petunia Dursley opened the door before he knocked. She looked at him. He looked at her. She was thin and fair-haired and held herself with the precise, controlled posture she had always held herself with. And she looked at him the way she had always looked at him, which was with the expression of a woman managing something that required managing. She said, "Your room is the second bedroom. Don't make noise on the stairs," he said. "All right." She stepped back. He carried his trunk over the threshold and up the stairs carefully, on account of the noise. That was the whole of their greeting, and it was, in its way, everything. The second bedroom was as he had left it in September. His things were not there. They had been in his trunk at Hogwarts for the past 10 months, but the room itself was there, with the bed and the window and the dimensions of a room that was a room and not a cupboard. It was small. It had been the smallest bedroom in the house for as long as Harry had known it, Dudley having taken the larger one as a matter of course. But small was not a category that caused Harry any difficulty. Small with a door that was yours was a different country from small without one. He set his trunk at the foot of the bed. He sat down. He noticed the lamp. It was on the desk, a small lamp with a green shade that had not been there in September, that had appeared at some point in the 10 months since he had last sat in this room. It was new, and it was functional, and it was not in any sense a gesture of warmth. It was a lamp. It was a lamp that had been placed on a desk in a room to meet the requirement that the room have adequate facilities for a child who was now, officially and legally, permitted to occupy it. He looked at the window. He stood up and crossed to it and tried the latch. It opened from the inside. It locked from the inside. It did not lock from the outside. He stood at the window for a moment and looked at the back garden. The garden looked the same. The flower beds, and the lawn, and the shed at the far end. He had weeded those flower beds every spring for as long as he could remember, which was a fact he was now in the habit of viewing as a fact rather than as a condition of residence which was new. A fact was a thing that had happened. A condition was a thing that defined what you were. He was still working out the difference in practice, but he understood it in theory, and understanding it in theory was a start. He went downstairs before supper. He stood in the hallway, at the foot of the staircase. The house was quiet. Petunia was in the kitchen. He could hear the muted sound of something on the cooker. And he stood in the hall for a moment, and then he reached out and put his hand on the latch of the cupboard door under the stairs and opened it. Inside, shoes. A row of Vernon's large shoes, and a pair of Petunia's going-out shoes at the back, and 2 umbrellas stacked in the corner, and a third hanging from a hook on the inside of the door. The floor was clean. The spiders were gone. Whatever webs had been there had been cleared out, the corners painted or plastered, the surface even and uniform. There was a light switch just inside the door that had always been there, but the bulb had been replaced. When Harry clicked it on, it worked. The bed was gone. There was no mark on the floor where it had been, no scuff or indent, no trace of the years of use. It looked like a cupboard. It looked like a perfectly ordinary understair cupboard in a perfectly ordinary house, on a perfectly ordinary street, the kind of place where people kept shoes and umbrellas and nothing else, the kind of place no one would look at twice. Harry stood with his hand on the door frame and looked at it. He tried to find the word for what he was feeling. He went through several candidates and found that none of them were right. It was not relief, because relief implied a threat that had lifted, and the threat here was 10 years past and had already been named and documented and placed in a folder that was still open, still under review, still being monitored by people in an office in Surrey. It was not grief, because grief was for losses, and what he was looking at was not a loss. He had already lost the thing that had happened in this cupboard. He had lost it by leaving it, and by being told that it was not normal, and by understanding what the blood protection meant, and by asking the question in Dumbledore's office that had needed to be asked, and by every meal in the great hall where he had let himself eat enough without waiting to see if the plate would be taken away. He was not grieving the cupboard. What he was doing, standing in the hall with his hand on the doorframe and the row of shoes in front of him and the replaced light bulb lit, was something more like looking at a place that had believed it could keep you small and finding that you were not small anymore. Not because anything about the cupboard had changed, though things had changed, not because of the shoes or the clean floor or the absence of the bed, but because the cupboard had been the size of the world once, and then Hogwarts had been the size of the world, and now neither of them was. The world was the size of the world, which turned out to be very large, and the cupboard was the size of a cupboard. He clicked the light off. He closed the door. He went to help with supper, and then remembered that he didn't have to, and stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment, and then went back upstairs to unpack his trunk instead. At Smeltings Academy, 300 miles north, Dudley Dursley was finishing his supper in the dining hall. He had a maroon tailcoat and a straw boater and a Smeltings stick that had seen a great deal of use over the course of the year, and he was having a very large portion of something involving chips. He was having a fine time at Smeltings. On the whole, he had made friends and played games and been comfortable in the way that people were comfortable when they had been taught, from the earliest age, that the world was arranged with them near the center of it. He did not know what had happened at home since September. His mother's letters had not told him, and he had not thought to ask, because there was nothing in his experience of home to suggest that home was the kind of place where things happened without him being told. He did not know that the sentence he had said in a classroom in September, the one about the cupboard, said in the tone of someone sharing an amusing peculiarity about their family, said without weight or comprehension or any sense that the boy in question might be listening from somewhere in his future self, had been turned into 19 pages in a document. He did not know that the document had been turned into a child protection plan. He did not know that his cousin had stood in a hallway in Surrey that afternoon with his hand on a cupboard door and found shoes on the other side. He ate his chips. He did not know that the cousin was 12 years old and had just survived his first year at a school that no one on Privet Drive had heard of, and had flown on a broomstick, and had learned that the ceiling of a very large room could be enchanted to look like the sky, and had eaten enough